Good evening, I'm Dennis Ward, and this is Face to Face. Our guest this week is filmmaker and educator Doreen Manuel. Doreen is the director of the Bosa Center for Film and Animation at Capilano University in North Vancouver. She recently co-authored an update to her father's biography, Brotherhood To Nationhood, George Manuel and the Making of the Modern Indian Movement. Doreen, thanks so much for being with us this week.
Well, I'm honored to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
The anniversary of your father, George Manuel's 100th birthday, has just recently passed on February 21st. Many might not be familiar with your dad. Can you tell us a bit about him?
George Manuel was born in 1921. He was a residential school survivor and went on to suffer from TB and be stayed at the Coquelitza Hospital for quite a while. He only received a formal education up to grade 2, and he was faced with a lot of struggle in his life. There was still segregation going on, and so he had so many of his community that were suffering so much that he wound up fighting for to stop segregation, and then helping a lot of people with their hunting and fishing rights. He befriended a non-Indigenous lawyer, and this was at a time when it was illegal for us to have legal representation, so he was mentored by that lawyer, and then he would go into the courts and represent people and tell the courts that he was an interpreter, but he was actually their lawyer. He was acting as their lawyer, and he would get them off on so many hunting and fishing cases. And that was really the beginning of it. He met Andy Paul, who was a leader who was traveling across Canada, uniting Indigenous people and finding ways, even though it was illegal to have meetings for Indigenous people to gather, Andy Paul was finding ways to get people to gather and to meet about the struggles. So a lot of people think that when the white paper was introduced in 1969, that was the beginning of the activism, but it wasn't. It was a point where it all came together and where people united into organizations. So it was through that whole time. George Manuel was already really heavily involved in politics because he had already started traveling across Canada by the time the white paper came along. So he was really instrumental in British Columbia. He was by that time working with Harold Cardinal in Alberta, and Harold was really concerned about the white paper. And the BC Indians were not really savvy at the time, so Harold, while my dad was working for Harold sent him to BC, and he said, George, you got to do something about your people because they, you have to help them understand the detriments of this document. So my dad came back, and I have his journals, you know, from 1966 onward, and it's amazing how much traveling he did. He hit like 3 towns in a day sometimes, and he'd be meeting with this chief and that chief and that chief and this group of people. And you know, even in his earlier days, there was no roads into Mount Currie, you know, communities like that. He'd take the train in, somebody'd meet him with horses, and he'd horseback ride in and stay a week and then come back out, educating people, helping them understand. You know, this is a time when there was, not everybody owned a phone. In fact, it was rare. There might be one phone in the entire community if they were lucky. Mm-hmm. So he was really all about the face-to-face. And then Harold talked him into running for national chief. And at the time, the National Indian Brotherhood was more of a paper organization. It didn't have an office yet. It hadn't really launched. So my father was the one who got the money together. I interviewed James Dacey, who was one of the people who helped him fundraise for the National Indian Brotherhood. And they got that organization up off the ground and turned it into the national lobbying organization for Canadian First Nations. And he ran that organization successfully for until his health started to fail. And during that exact same time, he was also forming the World Council of Indigenous Peoples. So he became the very first Indigenous person of the world to unite the Indigenous people of the world. Because at that time, only non-Indigenous people were holding international Indigenous conferences, and they were only inviting the people who they could influence and coerce. They weren't inviting the grassroots people. So my father had this vision to invite the grassroots people. So he managed to get himself on this trip. Len Marchand was a friend of his, and Len was an assistant to Chrétien at the time. And Chrétien was planning a trip with Trudeau to go to Hawaii, Australia, New Zealand, and do kind of like a, I don't know what you'd call it, a visit to these countries to build relations with Canada. Right. And they said, told Len, why don't you get an Indian to come with us? And Len said, any Indian? And he said, yeah, just get somebody to come with us. And so Len called my dad up and said, hey, George, you want to go on this trip? And he said, of course I do. So every country that they landed in, he went and actually met with the real people. He found a way to connect with them. By the time they got to New Zealand, the Trudeau and Chrétien were onto him, so they were making the schedule really tight so he couldn't get away. So the people that were serving him, the Maori who were serving them, he was whispering to them to come to his hotel room afterward, and they did. And he stayed up all night meeting with them, finding out what the real concerns of the real people were. So it was a struggle for him to raise the funding and to pull that meeting together and to pull the organization together. But with a lot of support, he was able to do that. And he was really a visionary when it came to dealing with the Canadian government. And he was so influential and so loved by ministers and senators. I remember being with him on Parliament Hill when ministers would slip him confidential documents. And then when his health failed, he came back to British Columbia and became the leader of the Union of BC Indian Chiefs. And during his time with the Union, he spearheaded the Constitution Express. So at that time, the Canadian government was wanting to introduce a constitution for Canada, and the document didn't include Indigenous people. So what that would have meant is if that got passed, we would cease to exist overnight. The government would find all its ways to slowly take away our land and all of our rights, and we would become ordinary Canadian citizens, which is really what Trudeau and Chrétien really wanted. They didn't believe in what they called us special citizens. And that was a huge maneuver because there were so many chiefs all across Canada fighting for this. But my dad united just thousands and thousands of people. And he hired 2 trains to come across Canada. That was the Constitution Express. They left Vancouver, one went up north by Edmonton, and the other one was going across, and they met and they came in. And it was spectacular. Every time the train would stop somewhere, there'd be hundreds of people there waiting with food, putting food on the train for them. And they got to Ottawa, and Trudeau wouldn't meet with them. And so my dad just said, you know what? He's not the one with all the power anyways. We're going to go on to England. That's where the power is, because they have the power to say no. And then all of a sudden, when Trudeau heard that, he wanted to meet with him. But by this time, my father just said, no, forget about it. We're just going back to BC. We're going to regroup. And, you know, in Ottawa, the mayor was even in support. She went on the radio and she said to all the people, hey, there's all these First Nations people coming in. Please consider building them, support them, open your homes to them. And they did. Our people were coming into Ottawa and going and staying in mansions. You know, there was so much support. And when they came back to BC, we had to do a lot of fundraising, and we did. And then there was an advance team went on to England and went through many of the countries over there, rallying support. And then the main crew came over, and they all met with the government in England, and the government completely saw the case and said they wouldn't sign off on that constitution unless Indigenous people were included. And then we were in Section 35. So he had a long history. He was an amazing person. You know, he didn't believe in wasting money. I grew up in a really frugal home. We cut coupons, and, you know, I never had any new clothes until I was well into my teens. He You know, when he would go traveling, he wouldn't go stay in fancy hotels. He'd sleep on people's couches. There's stories from people I'm, always running into people. They come up to me and they say, I knew your dad. He slept on my couch. And there were things that he did, like he was so down to earth. There was a plane strike one time, and he was in Ottawa. He needed to be back in British Columbia. He had promised the BC homemakers that he would be there to speak at their event. And so he took the bus all across Canada. And in his journal, he's writing about it, and he's not complaining about it. He's saying, this is kind of neat, taking the bus and seeing the land and eating sandwiches and reading. I got lots of time to read and write documents. And he was, growing up with him, it was like that. He always just kept us focused on the singular. Every decision has to be in respect and honor of the children yet unborn. And, one time we were at some meeting somewhere, and he was surrounded by people, and I was waiting for him. And this man was standing beside me, and he says, oh, I'm going to talk to your dad, but he won't remember me. I met him years ago. I stayed with that man till he got up to the front. And my dad turned around and saw him and said, oh, hi. And he knew his name, his wife's name, all of his children's names. And afterward, I asked him, how can you do that? That man didn't think you'd remember him. And he said, when you truly care about people, you're going to remember them. That's who George Manuel was.
Doreen, that's a great overview, and we're going to delve into a little deeper into some of those issues. We just have to step aside for a quick break, and then we'll continue the conversation here on Face to Face with Doreen Manuel. Welcome back to Face to Face. Our guest this week is Doreen Manuel, and we've been speaking about her father, George, whose 100th birthday recently would have passed. And Doreen, we touched on a lot of things you did in the last block there, but one of the things that your father also helped do was work on the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Can you talk about that work?
Well, that was the really early stages. I was interviewing Doug Saunders, who was a non-Indigenous lawyer who worked with my father. And it was Doug who told me that Dad was the one who spearheaded it. He said that my father had been talking about needing this document, because my father at the time was really interested in developing, uniting the people of the world. And he wasn't interested in being the one who saved them. He was interested in inspiring them to save themselves. Because, when you think about the era that we were in at the time, and not that much has changed, but enough has changed. It was a free-for-all through South and Central America with Indigenous people being slaughtered and murdered. And people were giving up hope of how they were going to get out of that. And so he was inspiring them to fight at all costs, not to give up. And so they were uniting, and in unity you have power. And so part of that was coming to the United Nations and forcing the United Nations to recognize those struggles that those people were having, and to do something about it. And part of that was this declaration. He envisioned, and that was the thing about him, is he could see 20, 30, 50 years down the road. He would know what was going to happen if we didn't do this or we didn't do that. So he was able to build a strategy and find ways to plan for that future. And that was one of the planning steps. And so all these years later, it was around would have been around 70, in the early 70s, when he came up with that. It might have even been 70 or 71.
All of this work, of course, led to not one but 3 Nobel Peace Prize nominations, which is really quite incredible. BC has passed its own UNDRIP legislation. We have the federal government now working on doing that as well. Are those bills, is that legislation living up to the original intent?
No, I mean, they're putting stipulations on it. They're not really passing anything. From my understanding, it's this will be in effect as long as it doesn't, as long as it falls in line with the laws that are already in place in British Columbia and in Canada. So that's not really broadening anything. It's just saying, yeah, we'll do it as long as it fits within what's already happening, as long as it fits within our parameters and our laws. So there's no nation to nation building there. It's just them squishing in some wording that doesn't really mean anything.
You also say he expressed concern about the future because your father's type of leadership seemed to be a dying breed. Do you think his concerns were warranted?
Yes, I do. When I look at the leadership out there today, there are far too many people supporting the pipelines and mining. There's mining going on reservations. People are dying, up in Fort McMurray. The moose are riddled with disease, and the people are starving, and they have to eat those moose, and then there's a high rate of people getting sick from it. There's so many communities across Canada that don't have clean drinking water. There's so many communities, there's so many people living in substandard conditions. Way back in the 60s when Indigenous people were talking about whether or not they should take program funding or they should stay focused on Aboriginal title and rights, they wound up deciding to take program funding because they said their people were starving, their people were unemployed, and they needed to get educated, and the housing and all these reasons. And so they wound up taking the funding, but really, we're still starving. We're still a lot of people who can't go to school because there's not enough education funding. So it's always just a few people from the communities that get to go. And then what happens is they go and they leave the community, they get educated, and because there's no housing at home, they stay out there. They don't come back to build the community. And so the services that we're accepting are not really helping us. Back in the 70s, we were having so much trouble with Indian affairs in my community, and my brother Bob was chief at the time, and my brother called my dad and said, I don't know what to do with Indian affairs. They're just, screwing us left and right. And so Dad said, reject funding. Send their peanuts back to them and say, to heck with you, we'll survive on our own. And we did. And I tell you, that was me gaining my warrior status. We went out hunting. I hunted. We went out hunting and fishing. We grew gardens. Like everybody in the community opened up their lands and we all grew gardens. Those of us who were already growing hay, when we sold the hay, we would throw the money in a pot and that would pay for the hydro bills, things for the kids that they needed. And we were independent and we were sober overnight. Before this happened, there was a lot of alcoholism in my community. And during and after that, no alcoholism. Everybody quit drinking. Everybody became a community. And we have continued in this gauntlet to be that community. We're one of the ones that won't enter into the treaty process because it's a ridiculous, unfair process. The comprehensive lands claims process is not, it's in this day and age, a treaty should be more than what it was in the past. And this is actually less than.
In our correspondence, Doreen, you mentioned a number of things that you think have gone wrong or gotten worse since your father's passing in 1989. One of those that you felt was the erosion in people's eyes of the role of the national chief. We have an APTN National Chief election coming this summer. What would you like to see happen?
Oh, I'd like to see, and this obviously can't happen before or it would take a while. The whole position needs to be re-examined. And, when my dad agreed to run for national chief, he wasn't crazy about the thought of a national chief. He said that it would that person would be removed from the community. So the reason why he traveled so much and went into little communities and stayed on people's couches and we're with the people so much is because that's what you have to do to stay connected. You have to be amongst your people. And you know, even when Perry Bellegarde ran the first time, he came into British Columbia and he only really came into Vancouver. He didn't even travel through BC. And I went to his fundraiser and I thought to myself, this guy isn't going to win because you can't just come to the city. You have to go meet the people. And he didn't win the first time. The second time he traveled throughout, but between losing that time and the next time he ran, he traveled. And then he managed to get in. But then he hasn't traveled since. You know, he hasn't really been around. And I'd like to see them totally revamp the entire chiefmanship in all communities all across Canada, because a chief is supposed to be a spokesperson. When you examine Indigenous languages, I know for my Secwepemc language, chief doesn't mean leader of all the people. It means spokesperson. Just the person who talks, that's all. Mm-hmm. And it's changed into something different now. Chiefs have a lot of power to make decisions without you. They can call votes, and even if everybody votes no, they can turn around and still say yes. They hold too much power over the funding.
Doreen, sorry, I have to hold you there for a minute because we just have to step aside for one more quick break, but then we'll continue the conversation here on Face to Face with Doreen Manuel. Welcome back to Face to Face. Our guest this week is Doreen Manuel. And Doreen, we've been talking about the book about your father, and we're short on time here. But in the book, Pam Palmater refers to your father, George, as one of the greatest Native leaders of our time. Should your father's story and the work he did be recognized in school curriculum?
You know, it should, because our children need to form an identity, and the identity that they're forming from watching what's in television right now is, you know, the access they have to information. It's about other people's cultures, and that's why we're having so many problems with, you know, high suicide rate and children going missing, and we're not like building our children to be able to be strong and to protect themselves and to build our communities. You know, they're not being given information that is vital for their identity building. And if they're going to become leaders someday, we're not giving them the information that they need to become leaders. In the, you know, old days, we used to actually train our leaders and build them up into that position. Today, when people become leaders, and if they don't, that's all they have is their high school education, they haven't received a traditional education, they're going into that position not prepared to lead their people.
Doreen, so much more about your father and the book that we could have talked about. I feel bad we didn't even get to talk about your own films and your own incredible work for which you've been held in high regard. So I think we'll have to have you back on the show, but really appreciate you taking the time for us here this week.
Thank you very much.
That is all the time we do have for this week. You can catch up on any episodes you may have missed by visiting our website, aptnnews.ca. And Doreen's got her own websites out there. Please check those out, including her latest film, Unceded Chiefs. These shows are all available as podcasts. You can find those at aptnnews.ca/face-to-face podcast. I'm Dennis Ward. Thanks for tuning in. Have a great night.